Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. We will be addressing the educator effectiveness and overcoming the achievement gap through family, community, and school partnerships. Joining me today is Richard Gray, the Director of Community Organizing and Engagement Division of the Annenberg Institute for School Reform at Brown University. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Richard in just a moment, but before I do that, I'd like to find out who all of you are. You'll see a poll come up on your screen in just a moment, and you can select the response that best fits the role in which you serve. Glad to see such a large and diverse audience with us today. Our hope is that through today's presentation, whatever role you might serve in, you'll find some information that you can take back to the work that you do. Great to see a lot of district level and state level folks with us. Very good. Well, we'll give you a lot more opportunities to share with us throughout the 2 hours that we'll be together this afternoon, and we look forward to hearing from you all. At this time, I'd like to introduce our presenter for the day, Richard Gray. As I mentioned, Richard is the Director of Community Organizing and Engagement Division of the Annenberg Institute for School Reform at Brown University. He was previously the Director of National Technical Assistance with the Community Involvement Program at New York University's Institute for Education and Social Policy, and he received his JD from the University of California at Berkeley. A little bit more about the work that he currently does with the AISR. You'll hear a little bit more about this through today's presentation, but the Institute offers support to school districts, community groups, researchers, national and local school reform organizations in their efforts to address the persistent achievement gaps and to develop sustainable education reform. His work includes providing strategic support on community organizing and engagement to the community and school reform organizations in cities across the country, and directing the Center for Education Organizing at the Annenberg Institute for School Reform in order to help expand the power of education organizing through building strategic alliances among organizations and with strategic partners such as teacher unions, reform support organizations, civil rights organizations, and research and policy institutes. In his prior work, Richard has done work across the country in developing strategies to improve local schools and shape more effective and equitable education policies. He was previously the co-executive director of the National Coalition of Advocates for Students, a nationwide network of child advocacy organizations that work to improve the access of quality public education to student populations who have been traditionally underserved by public schools. As you can tell, he comes to us with a lot of experience and work in this area, and I am excited to introduce Richard Gray.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for participating in this webinar. I want to start off by saying I believe I'm the last of a number of these webinars, so there's going to be a little bit of a party, I think, for the people who have been organizing this effort. I want to take this opportunity to say that they have been extremely helpful and supportive in helping me to get this together, and so if it is any success that's going to be a part of this webinar, they are definitely the primary contributors to it. I also wanted to say that by way of background, you can see I'm an attorney by training. My mother was a longtime educator, which may be the reason why my arc went from law into education. But the work that I do, I am in no ways claiming to be an expert on the issue of the achievement gap. I know some things fairly well. There was a man in my church who used to say, I don't know much, but what I know to pieces. And I think that's true in this context. I do know work particularly around the issue of how to build partnerships with families, communities, and educators to be able to address particular issues in the gap. But where I don't know something, I will say it, and hopefully through my efforts and the efforts of the folks who have organized this, we will get answers to any questions that we do not hit. Let me move on to sort of setting the stage for what we're going to be doing, and that's sort of an overview. During the webinar, we'll be talking briefly, and won't go into great detail, but something to give you an overview on why the achievement, what it is and why the achievement gap exists, and how to consider supporting schools with students who are impacted by the achievement gap in producing better outcomes, and some detailed actions on helping teachers in schools effectively support their students from different backgrounds. And in particular, again, my area of focus will be on how to build partnerships with families, communities, reform support organizations to help teachers in schools do this. So the underlying principle is that schools and teachers can't do this alone, that it's going to require a collaborative effort. So let's go into very quickly what we mean by achievement gap. And I'm going to try not to be one of those folks who puts up a chart and then reads it for you. I think this gives a good definition, so I'll let people read it. But I think the main focus of here is that the gap focuses on gaps in achievement of particular groups, and that gap is larger than the statistical difference that you would see in the error that you would see in the data. So that it's not an anomaly of the data; it actually shows a particular gap. The gaps are often divided up looking at subgroups: male, female, non-white, Black, Latino, others. There's also gaps that look at socioeconomic, and the focus is really on the gap. If one group were to improve and the other group improves as well and the gap remains, while we would celebrate the improvement of both groups, we also want to look at the fact that the improvement of the group that's not performing as well did not narrow the gap. And those gaps are affected by a variety of things: demographically, the size of the populations that you may have, non-white versus white. So that impacts the gap that you will see in the achievement. Now, we often talk about achievement as the achievement gap and think about the outcomes, the things that we traditionally measure: test scores, grades, performance. But it also can be other achievement, what we might call achievement indicators, things that if they don't exist, will give us some indication that achievement will either be difficult or impossible. So issues of attendance, discipline, persistent students who are in and out of the system. So those are also things when we look at gaps of groups. If there are gaps in some of these other areas, invariably it's going to impact the things that we see in terms of achievement. Let's look briefly at some of the research. And looking at the Stanford Graduate School of Education research, they did an overview of reading and math scores from 2009 to 2013. And what they found were things that probably a number of us on this webinar know, that there were, in places where you had low-income students, there was a significant gap between their performance and the national average in the grade level. In nearly all districts where there were high minority populations, we saw those gaps in certain racial groups between white, Black, and between white and Hispanic. A couple of things here. The most and least advantaged, disadvantaged districts had their performance level really impacted by where those students fell on the socioeconomic scale. In places where you had kids attending higher poverty schools, you saw a bigger gap. And I think I want us to sort of put a pin in this notion about higher poverty school later when we talk about some of the other ways of measuring this. And that there were large gaps in educational attainment that were connected in many ways to the educational attainment of parents. Again, this is a broader research, and I think it's in the resources to be able to get a more detailed level. But the idea is that these gaps exist. The research also implied that in order to be able to address these gaps, you're going to have to consider things that are much broader than just what do schools do. That they're going to require a multidisciplinary approach. And that implies that it goes beyond education itself to be able to address these things. I'll reference a researcher that folks may know, Dr. James Comer, who has done some seminal work years ago on looking at this issue. And we talked about the fact that children learn on, he defined 6 different levels. There's physical, there's the cognitive, there's language, ways you communicate, there's social, the kinds of relationships they're able to develop, there's ethical, how do they treat folks in those relationships, and there's psychological, there's sense of self. And that schools, while they hit some of these, they can't hit all of them. And so it requires, if you're going to truly educate kids and go beyond just education based on test scores and what we do academically, that it requires some collaboration between the places that children learn physical, where they learn language, where they learn socially, where they learn their ethics. And that kind of collaboration is necessary to be able to address the gaps that may exist in any of these areas. You've heard us talk before about the achievement gap. In the work that I do, and this is some research from the Schott Foundation, the achievement gap looks at outcomes. What are the test scores? What are the things that students are doing? It's largely focused on the students themselves, and it's important information. The opportunity gap looks at the disparity in the inputs. What are the things that are actually around the student, around the educator, that may be at a deficient level that gives us some indication about why the achievement is where it is. So what's the quality of the facilities? What's the quality of the early education? What's the quality of the teacher supports and preparation? What's the quality of the curriculum? A variety of inputs that actually give us an insight into why the achievement gap exists. And so from the Schott Foundation standpoint, you can't look at one without looking at the other. We have to look at what are the kinds of things we're investing in achievement, and we know works for achievement, and can we point to those deficiencies as being the reason why this gap exists. A couple of things that the research, and this is from the Stanford Center for Opportunity, Policy, and Education and the National Education Policy Center that looked at this issue for Schott. There are a couple of things that they said could help address some of the opportunity gaps. Focusing in on individual student needs, we've heard a lot about providing health, addressing health issues. We'll talk a little later about a community schools model and others that take that into account. Correctly identifying the needs of language minority students. And there's a recently, Ed, we talked about the shift in the College Board to allow for more accommodations for students with language minority students on taking tests. It's sort of a notion that we want to be able to engage folks at the level of their capacity, not on limits by language. And expanding early childhood clearly is something that came up in a number of the questions that we got before, and it's really important for us to be able to invest in that at a higher level. One of the things we could do at a very easy level would be to, at some point, fully fund Head Start. I don't think it's ever been fully funded, but it's a program that clearly has an impact and success. In-school opportunities, and that I think are key. And again, I won't go through all of them. Around safety, clearly, really big pushback on focusing on tests or test reform, tests that are really geared towards getting information to teachers and educators as opposed to being used as a sorting or punitive tool. Changing discipline policy, there's been big pushes towards more restorative justice practices that actually help to address some of the underlying issues around discipline and also keep kids in schools. It's really a way of looking at discipline as in terms of a teacher, not in terms of a cop. How do we begin to teach policy through discipline policy through how we engage students? But I think one of the main areas I really want to focus in on are the ideas of more and better learning opportunities, ways of really engaging, and this goes back to the Comer concept, of looking at school not as the only place kids learn, but as one of the primary places, but how does it connect to out-of-school learning opportunities, and what's the collaboration that exists between adults that engage these children and these students outside of schools and those in schools. And also the idea of really looking at investing in teaching as a profession. We're in an environment now both politically and I think culturally, where we have not valued teachers and we haven't valued teaching. And I think it's a big important to make a shift between teachers and teaching. Right now, we look at we're going to give more money to good teachers and we're going to get rid of bad teachers. A lot of the focus, particularly in the work that we do and in the efforts when you bring parents and communities together, they don't talk about teachers, they talk about teaching. And how do you invest in good teaching? You can become a better teacher by improving your teaching. And the challenge is not for you to be a better person, it's for you to invest in your practice. How do you invest in people being better at their practices teaching? And that simple shift is really a very important thing that we'll talk about later. There's other research that's been done. The seminal work that was done by Ann Henderson, Karen Mapp, who are the primary researchers on this, that have talked about the importance of family-school partnerships. It's called Beyond the Bake Sales. It came out several years ago, but they've done several iterations of it. And it talks about the idea that it's not a Pollyannish idea just that we want to have parents and communities involved, but that there's a real improvement in the quality and effectiveness of teaching by having that collaboration. And then it's important for us to figure out ways of not only thinking about the collaboration, just saying we want to have parents and families work together, but to say, how are we involving families? Who do we involve in that process to make sure that it happens? What are the ways that we support that through resources and structures? And how do we make sure that that involvement is not just about, as you see in this quote here, not just about having people come together and maybe having bake sales, but having that involvement particularly focused on involving around the issues of teaching and learning, bringing it close to the teaching and learning practice, and so that the involvement is based on the idea that that having parents and communities and families in that process improves actual teaching and learning. There are a couple of things that speak to that are three areas of focus: connecting in family school partnerships, creating opportunities for there to really be a district focus on that, focus on teaching and learning, creating a culture of support for this kind of practice, and to build structures, not just depend on the capacity of an individual teacher or individual parent to be able to do this, but to have structures both at the classroom, at the school, and at the district level that actually support this kind of collaboration. I think we're at our first point for open-ended question.
We are. Thank you, Richard. That was a great introduction to the topic. I know folks in our audience come from a variety of backgrounds and have different levels of understanding of this topic, so I think that gets us all on the same page and starts our conversation for today. So now what we'd like to do is open the floor for you all to respond to the question on the screen. We are wondering, in your experiences, what evidence have you seen of the achievement and opportunity gaps that Richard had talked about in the schools and districts where you work? So you'll see a poll box come up, and this is open-ended, so you can type in there some examples of evidence you've seen. While you're all getting some responses together, I'll mention a few housekeeping items. Folks who want to download the presentation, you can find that down in the bottom in the resources to download box. There's a copy of the PowerPoint there. There's also a document with some additional resources. Richard's going to reference a few things throughout today's conversation. There's a Word document there that has a list of some links that you might want to look at. In the web links box, we have two housekeeping things we'll talk about a little bit later, but the Parent Power CC9 section web link is an example that we're going to be talking about a little bit later. So hopefully that answers your question about resources. I see there are some questions coming through in the parking lot, and we'll make sure to address as many of those as we can throughout today's discussion.
The reference I made to Comer, in the resources that listed, there's a link to his website, the Yale Child Development Center. And so I know I've brushed over something that's really very detailed, but it's in one of the references.
Super. So, Richard, let's take a look at the responses that are coming in.
Okay.
I'll also just remind folks, you can respond to this particular question in the box in the center of your screen. We'll save the parking lot for the conversation and questions that you might have while Richard's presenting. And as a side note, you will all be able to access a transcript of the discussion from today after the event. So we do keep a record of this, and I know there's a lot of great ideas that come out of your sharing your experiences. So here we go. There's lots here, so let's take a look.
All right. What's the district?
Lots of disparity in test scores.
Yeah.
A lot of examples of that.
I saw something, this is in the parking lot, but it's connected to the differences in the state assessments. So there's a range in the assessments, and something that will come up a lot, sort of a disparity in spending, which has really been a big issue. And clearly funding is going to be a core part of whatever response and solution that we need to have. Disparities in discipline. So we're looking at a lot of disparities, places where we see differences in both in not only performance but also impact. Students are impacted differently by a range of these things.
Lack of family involvement. We'll be getting into that today.
Right.
Some of our special populations and students with disabilities, English learners, students of specific racial and ethnic backgrounds.
Right.
I know, as you mentioned, there were a few questions related to preschool, and although we're not going to go directly into that today, we recognize that that's an area that could be focused on as one of the solutions for the K-12 achievement gap.
Mm-hmm. We often see that kids are affected by what they get in the previous iteration of their education and what they bring to the next level. And so very often the transition points, preschool to elementary, elementary to middle, middle to high, high to any post-secondary, often it's those transitions that become difficult. And what we found is, and this exists in K-12 in a lot of ways, that there's not a whole lot of collaboration even between educators in those different levels. So it would make sense to me, just as an example, that if we're talking about college ready, that there should be conversations and collaborations and structures that support it for educators at the post-secondary level to be engaged with folks in higher ed. It would make sense that there's some collaboration and understanding. But very often we silo those different areas, and then the students are the ones that actually communicate what's happening.
And on that note, we recently, just a few months ago, ran a webinar on the topic of the middle to high school transition. So if folks are interested in learning more about that and some strategies to approach that particular transition, you can go back to the REL Educator Effectiveness site, and that archive should be there.
Okay, and we have also, we have a CRIS, our College Ready study that we did, funded by Gates, that talks about a lot of this, particularly at the high school level and high school to college, and so I'll share that as a resource after the fact.
Well, there's certainly no shortage of examples here of how the achievement gap and the opportunity gap are playing out around the country. And so I want to take us into the next section where you'll talk to us a little bit more about some of the current theory and the work that's happening, so we can get into examples and some solutions.
Right. So I think that now it's back to me, sort of current theory. And I'm going to start a little bit with some theory from the National Education Association, and then flow into areas that are around both my experience and work area around theories of engaging families and communities in this work. But I do think that the NEA information is really very instructive and useful as a setup. As you can see here, there are a couple of focuses. One is, and it goes back to the question, that you can't do anything about this unless there's an opportunity really for people at schools and in districts to have access to and examine data about what are the best strategies, and also identifying that sometimes those best strategies already exist at some level. And we often sort of say, well, you go someplace and say, well, how do we improve this? And very often we overlook the fact that there are pockets of those kinds of things that we want to do that exist right in our midst. I'll use by way of an example, we did a large-scale study of education organizing, parents and communities organizing to really push equity issues and concerns, demanding resources for many of the populations that you described in the question area. One of the things that educators said about that is that they found two things, or the research said about that is they found two things that showed success. Number one, it goes back to a point we talked about before. It wasn't just parents and communities, but when parents and communities could find opportunities to build a collaboration or coalition with educators, researchers, administrators, so they could find something that they could work on together. It might have been brought to them by communities, but there was a collaboration built. It was more successful. And the second thing was when you identified something that was already working in the system, so your push wasn't to say to do something new, it was identifying something in the system and say, how do we bring it to scale? And that's been a part of the challenge of a lot of our work. We tend to know how to do small episodic, but we haven't really invested the time and energy to take some of our successes and bring them to scale. And so I think the NEA talks about that. And then how do we resource that to make sure that the new actions and the new strategies that need to take place actually are able to do so. There are 9 things, and again, I'm not going to read through all 9. We're actually going to go through them very quickly, each of the individual slides, that are just strategies to consider. And I think I want to say, even though maybe NEA, they're probably saying because they talked about it that way, these are not the 9 silver bullets. These are not the 9, this is not the holy grail here. These are things to consider, things that folks have done that have shown improvement and people believe are at least strategies for us to be able to consider. And they're also not meant to be sequential or one over the other. Some may be needed more in one area than the other, and they need to be applied as such. First, cultural competence. And we often talk about culture and cultural competence. We should think about culture as a context for learning, that there are sets of ways people think about things, way people communicate. And culture isn't just culture, whether it be culture of a community, whether it be Latino or African American or various cultures. It's also a culture of a school. Schools have culture. And so having the ability to sort of know and understand cultures and be able to translate those cultures becomes a key asset in being able to create a context where learning is possible. And so how do you figure out the best ways to be able to do that? Largely that is first having an opportunity to know and understand that culture, which often invites a partnership with people who have an understanding of that culture with you to say, you know this culture better than me, let's build a partnership so that I can learn as much as I can, but there are going to be things I can't learn, but if I have you here working with me, your competency around this will be able to pull us through. And then what is the opportunities and structures that allow for that kind of relationship to exist? Comprehensive supports for students. Again, we'll talk, this is very consistent with the Comer model that we talked about, that the different ways that impact learning at different levels. And so how do we begin to think about ways that students may need supports beyond what we can do in the classroom or even in the school? And so what are the ways that we're able to align those supports so that not only do we respond to the needs of children, but it gives them the greater chance, greater opportunity, going down opportunity gap, to be able to take in and to acquire the kind of knowledge we're trying to teach in schools. One really good example of this, this was actually initiated by students. They were called Student Success Centers. It was started by the Philadelphia Student Union. They started to just poll students on why they don't take advantage of different services, academic services, college access, and what they found is they said, we have to figure out where all these different things are and talk to different people. We're not always aware. If there was one place we could go just to get the information, that would be great. And so they based that and did some research, and they developed a concept called Student Success Centers. The Student Success Centers are a collaboration between a community group and the school. They are actually governed as a governing body that includes students, and it's the one place where you go to get your peer mediation, college, career information, anything around social support. And what it does is creates a place that is really focused on success of students, saying if you come here, you're going to be able to get your needs served. And it was important to do it in the school because that's the place they wanted to do it, but also it was important to have a partnership with community to let them know that the services that they were going to be getting wouldn't just be limited to what the school provided. Outreach to families, we'll be going into a little bit more about this. But one thing I do want to stress here, because we had a number of educators, one of the things that always I find problematic in the way that we often view outreach, there's always usually an outreach coordinator. There's one person who's responsible for reaching out to communities. And what we need to begin to think about it is this is not an individual capacity of an individual person, it's a system. Just like we have to have a system to develop curriculum and instruction, there needs to be not just one person, but a range of people with a variety of capacities that build these partnerships, that do the outreach, that help to provide the workshops. So even a shift of looking at this outreach from a person to a system is really very important. Extended learning opportunities, we talked a little bit about that before. There's a piece that is from Annenberg that was funded by the Ford Foundation that gives you actually 24 indicators of really good, effective extended learning opportunities, our more and better learning work, but really talks about the importance of building collaboration between educators in classrooms and in schools and the adults and support systems that students have outside of the classroom, both, as we say here, before they even start school, but also those supports even extend to helping to keep kids in college as well. Classrooms that are supportive. And again, this is really looking at the variety of strategies that help with diverse learners. How to employ test information. I think a lot of what we find in our collaborations, and we'll talk about it a little bit later, is both teachers and families and communities have really been pushing back on our massive test culture. This idea that our kids are just tested constantly, and the tests aren't, or not, I won't say all of them, but many of them aren't based on providing information to the educator, to the parent, to the student on how to improve their practice. And so there's been a really big effort to find those kinds of assessments that are actually embedded in the practice that allow for you to, in real time, get information about what's happening in the classroom and then to directly apply that information into the classroom context. Supportive schools. This is pretty straightforward. You're actually building up a culture of support, and I want to give sort of an example of why sometimes just a small change can really be a big difference. I was at a meeting where they were looking at some of these issues around family engagement, really around school discipline. There was a disparity in discipline. And what they found is the culture of how people feel about the school starts with the greeting they get in the morning. And a gentleman stood up who was in business, and he said, you know, I work with Walmart, and you know how they have the Walmart greeters who greet you and say hello? He said they don't do that necessarily because it's just a nice thing to do. What they found is when you have those folks, when you greet people at the front door, they steal from you less. They used to call it shrinkage, actually, which I thought was an interesting nondescript term. But the idea was the first impression somebody has about how they're greeted when they first walk through the door actually creates a connection to, do I feel some ownership, or do I feel a sense of support and responsibility for this institution? And I think very often schools, and I won't limit it to schools, a lot of we do it a lot in society, we don't think about how important those very small impressions are in creating a culture of support. Strong district support for this work, and I think this can't be overstated. That I think there, in the work that we do, and I think that this is also coming from from NEA. The idea that a district really communicates its commitment to this work is quite critical. And it's important that it not just be a verbal commitment, we're saying we're doing better, but it actually is followed by the practice of a district. One of the big shifts we think is really important is the shift of the central office or district from one that seems to be monitoring to one that is actually capacity building, so that people begin to see the district as an entity that supports the development of practice, supports and there are resources at the district level for that to be able to happen. I'll give you an example that actually also speaks to some of the individualized needs of students. There was an issue in a number of schools, but in Oakland, California, there was this recognition through their data that they were not doing well by African American male students, African American students across the board, but they focused in on African American male students. And at the district level, the superintendent said, we have to make a commitment to this, to improving this. And he did two things that I think are really quite important. Number one, he created a structure that said, we're not just going to do this, but I'm going to actually create a superintendent level a position, cabinet position, that really focuses in on this issue and build a structure and a budget that focuses just on this issue of African American male performance. And the second thing is it shifted it from African American males performing poorly to calling it African American male student success. This notion that our focus is not on just addressing a problem, but on achieving success. And having that as a priority is very important, and backing it up with resources and structure are quite important as well. And I think it's one of those things where, again, seemingly that small shift in language does create a sense that it gives a vision for what the district's doing, and then it's supported by policy and budget, which is quite important. One thing that I want to speak to on this next slide is the idea of targeted resources. Very often there's a challenge or strategy. Well, for example, we can use the one in African American males, and I think there's a valid pushback that African American females or Latino male and females have as difficult an issue, and why not focus in on those groups? And I think we'd like to think it's not a zero-sum game in that context. But one of the things that the targeted resources do is, and I think Oakland's response to that was this notion of targeted universalism. And I shared a document in the list that goes into this more deeply, but the very quick explanation is that you can target in on a particular population, but by targeting in on that population, say African American males, you're going to learn something about how to better teach and better resource other students who are struggling. And one of the examples that we often give is when you go out and walk outside, you'll often get to a curb and you'll see a dip on the curb. And that was put in place to make it more accessible to folks who have physical needs, wheelchairs and others. But as a parent of now, a 16-year-old is no longer in a stroller, but he was at one point. It also helps parents who have kids who are in strollers. It also helps people who are elderly who may be using a cart. It's a variety of a range of people who actually reap the benefit of that change, even though the change was targeted for a particular population. So that's in a very nutshell, the notion of targeted universalism. And again, this is just a restatement of the 9 strategies. I will say, just overview, that while the 9 strategies, they really focus in on this notion of creating a vision for the kinds of changes that you want to make to close the achievement. Many of them also employ a sense of not just a vision of the school or of educators or of school staff, but really building a sense of shared vision between a range of people, either at the district, school level, community, parents, a shared vision for what you're trying to do, and then the resources and structures that actually support that in the long term. I think we're now at the end of our second, and onto our second open-ended question.
Very good, yes. That last little section generated a lot of commentary and questions in the parking lot. So while I get folks poised to respond to this question, Richard, you might want to take a glance over there at some of the comments and the questions. But for folks in the audience, if you can look on the screen, we have a question here in reference to the 9 NEA strategies that Richard just discussed. How have you seen those implemented in your schools and districts, or which of those have you seen implemented? I'm going to go back actually to the prior slide so you can see them, and we're going to move the box down a little bit so that you can see that list and reference those. I know many of the points you all made in the parking lot really do sort of answer this question already, but we'll give you a minute to do that. And while you're doing that, Richard, I glanced up pretty far because questions were coming in for a while. And I want to just acknowledge something that you and I had already talked about, but I want to make it clear for our audience. There's a lot of questions about specific instructional strategies or assessment approaches. And while we're not going to go deeply into those two topics today, we acknowledge that those are important areas of considering how to close the achievement gap. We're just not going to go into specific examples today because that's not your area of expertise. And we're going to go a little more deeply into the community engagement piece. So I just want to let folks know about that. And there was a little bit of discussion, question related to whether folks are using GIS or other visualization to show community assets or data patterns. And it sounded like some folks were responding to that question and sharing their experiences. And I didn't know if, Richard, that's an area that you have seen any work in or done yourself.
Not directly, though I know a number of folks who have done that. And I think it's, you know, we've used a number of strategies. One, and again, we'll get to that a little bit later when we talk about the role of research organizations working in collaborations with educators and parents, but also developing opportunities for there to be participatory research projects where you bring in parents. I know educators have used that quite a bit to actually go in and not only get this data, but to also do the data analysis, develop the research questions for gathering the data and building sort of mini findings and reports, and sometimes larger reports based on that data. And so the idea for us is both identifying the assets, but it's also how do you communicate those assets exist and what can they be what do we do with them? And very often that may fall on a researcher or someone else. When you can create a process where there is again that multi-disciplinary cross-sector analysis, review of questions, of challenges, and come up with a shared conclusion, very often the assets of a community come out most notably in the pursuit of a particular goal or outcome or answer of a question. And so we'll talk a little bit later about what we see as some of those capacities as being, but I definitely think that's an important part of the work.
Very good. Well, let's take a look here at some of the responses that are coming in.
I see early warning systems. I think that's there's so much of, I was just looking at the last one that came through about opportunities and structures that actually get us information early so that we're not looking at a problem long down the road, but some of these indicators that give us a sense that if we can intervene here, we can actually address those issues.
I see several folks noted extended learning opportunities, various examples there.
One of the things my son always hates about me when I do these presentations is I'm a strong believer in that we need to really rethink the structure of education. We go to school from September to May and June based on an agrarian calendar. And, you know, most of us are not in that context, and we haven't changed it to what I think should be a year-round process that would allow for there to be less downtime, more opportunities for students to be able to not fall back. There's a lot of research on what's lost in students during that summertime. And I think building those out of school learning times, or sort of more and better learning times, gives an opportunity to both support and maintain a consistent environment for education. My son always hates when I say year-long. Year-long. He loves the summer.
I see a couple notes about social emotional learning. I think that's an interesting, not directly in this list, but peripheral to a couple of the strategies here.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, that's been a critical part of the work that we do. I won't go into it, but you have the link to the Annenberg website. We actually support a youth group coalition called the Urban Youth Collaborative that high school students who have been really working on issues of education. Their first start was that they wanted to have a higher ratio between students and guidance counselors. And we actually in New York City have more school safety officers who are the police in schools than we have guidance counselors. And their thing is we need to turn that around. And one of the things they've talked about is the push for restorative justice practices rather than the more punitive discipline. And embedded in that is the idea that it's not just being soft on kids by saying you're not going to have consequences, but to recognize that a lot of the behavioral issues are tied to issues around emotional, social, emotional challenges that students have. And so how do we invest in actually providing an opportunity to address those things?
Well, I think one of the last comments that came in really sums this up for us all. Nicholas says, to some extent, all of them, but continuity, sustainability, and consistency are vital. I think that's a good segue to sort of end this part of the discussion, because that is absolutely true, that, you know, it might seem easy to tackle one or two of these things, but, you know, focusing on all of them at once isn't going to be possible either. And really maintaining that and continuing that over time is where real work happens. And so, you know, you'll talk to us a little bit more about some examples as we move forward. Okay, let's go into this next section. You're going to talk to us more about the work that the Annenberg Institute is doing.
Yes, and I will open this up by saying I'm also, this is the work of not only Annenberg, but also of, I'm sorry, I did it. As you see here, you already got an overview of what Annenberg does, and it's in that area below. We have a couple of areas of practice. I mentioned our district and systems transformation. Essentially, that is a group that is predicated on the notion that districts cannot do this work alone, and that there needs to be a way of looking at systems that enables them and supports them in doing the work that they need to do, but also creates partnerships and strategies for partnerships and building capacity for partnership within districts to be able to bring in other resources from universities, from communities, from businesses to be a part of the education process. And our focus is primarily on doing so to produce more equitable schools, to deal with issues of equity. We have our research and policy that does the same thing, focuses on research and policy practices, particularly those that are addressing issues of what's going to be create a better system for student populations that have traditionally been underserved by public schools, which we have named. The division that I head up is called the Community Organizing and Engagement, which really focuses on the notion of communities being a central part of the process for building a better system, and also becoming a vehicle for parent and community participation that goes beyond just individual parents, which is important to support, but also the notion that parents and communities and families live in communities that actually have a wealth of capacity, but also institutional history around education that would be useful to use in the school process. And so there's a value and power that they should be bringing to that process. So let me just go very quickly over this. And I'm also very curious in getting in the question feedback on this, because this is really the theory of the work with our work within Annenberg. Going back to what I was saying about BST, there's been a growing recognition over time, particularly as there have been demands, and I think equity demands on schools to educate students that if we went back 50, 60 years ago, those students wouldn't be a part of the system. We would say, yes, they can drop out. And actually, my grandparents never made it past the 5th grade. My father made it to the 10th grade. My mother, who's an educator, went beyond that. But there was this notion that not everybody was going to go on to either high school or beyond. And so there wasn't really a demand on school systems to actually educate those kids. And I think increasingly to our demands that our system be more equitable and not have those kids leave and to provide a system that includes and keeps them, it's produced greater demands on schools to do things that they haven't historically had to do. Now that's something that doesn't mean that we don't do it. It means that the challenge is bigger than just the district itself, and we need to figure out ways of building partnerships with districts that allow for capacity, resources, ideas to be able to come in and work in collaboration. We call it a smart education system, but it's a system, a network that goes beyond just the school system itself. And we often do that informally, the relationships that schools and districts have with these, but to really create a formal structure that says, this is the kind of work that we do. We often find that in doing that work, it's easier to think about these partnerships with larger elite organizations, universities, large-scale nonprofits, businesses. But we found that if we want to get to issues of equity and issues of challenges for particular populations and communities, that there needs to be the involvement of a different set of players that actually are able to speak to this issue and have actually been trying to address this issue in different ways. And going back to the smart education system, this idea that you provide resources to students in and out and build a structure that allows for learning to happen seamlessly and mobilize demand for a more accountable system, but also demanding others in the community to participate in that system in an accountable way as well. And it also implies different forms of collaboration, leadership, different structures that allow for greater engagement. One of the things that I often find in the education system is that it's one of the least collaborative structures, and I'm not saying that in a demeaning way to folks who are educated. I don't think it's built into the system. It's not something that folks are taught. I think there's been a shift in that. But this idea of being able to build collaboration and partnerships, often it's a demand we put on the system, but it isn't often something that we either give people the capacity to do, prepare them, give them support to be able to do it. Let me give you quickly the theory of change, and this is a theory of change around our community organizing and engagement division. And when we think about it, this question, we would often look, and we started this work back in 1995 in New York City. And one of the things we looked at when we looked at different schools that were not performing at a high level and low income and communities of color is they were very often viewed as communities that hadn't recognized their power to be able to, and their social capital, to be able to change what was going in the system. In short, we're saying those schools were allowed to be bad because there was a sense that there wasn't going to be any either consequence or support to make them any better. And that our belief was that if you created a process that allowed for the democratic engagement of parents and residents in study, in action, that you would tap into a power and capacity for them to demand and support better education in their schools. This is a structure, and I'll go through this and also give you sort of this is always a process in motion. There's also some different ways you can look at this as well. So you have at the center parent leadership, parents being able to sort of undergo a better sense and a different sense of their capacity, parents being seen by the public officials and others in a light that is less detrimental or as a deficit, but more as an asset, collective action to actually, by parents to actually engage system change, and then the leadership invigorates democracy. And one of the ways to look at this as well would be to look at that center as being a place where parents, and I'm going to emphasize communities, and we'll say a little bit later why we expand that to communities. And we actually should say beyond parents, you should say families as well, because very often it might be we want to engage a family member that might not be the parent, but might be the sole and the clear adult guardian of that particular child, even though it may not be in a legal sense. How to build their leadership capacity, how to build people's capacity to be able to have a sense of what they want and feel like they have the skills and capacities to actually bring it about. Developing a structure, and I will go to two, would be a structure for parents and communities to develop their knowledge access to information, data. And one of the things we've done with the parents when we were talking with parents, a parent said, you know, I know what a bad school is, but I don't know what a good one is. And so part of that knowledge was to actually go to a place that had the same kind of kids that lived in the community, same kind of kids as her kids, but they were actually engaged in teaching so that it would help her to get a vision for the kind of school that she wanted. And then to realize through that the kind of strategic partnerships that needed to be developed to actually bring that about, which led us to sort of thinking about partnerships with teachers and with educators to be able to bring that about. The third might be how to take collective action. And it's important that we're not just talking about individual parents talking about the individual needs of the kids. That's clearly important. Every parent comes from that standpoint. But beginning to see, if I have the same issue as the parents in my communities, how can we work collectively to be able to actually impact this so that it benefits all of us? And us working together have more power and capacity than us working individually. The next step might be public officials, and I would emphasize educators, seeing parents not just as assets, but also as potential partners. And I add the notion of potentials because it's not, I don't want to be Pollyannish that everybody just gets along. Very often, it isn't always seen immediately that a parent can be a partner. But the potential's there through the capacity of people to bring the knowledge they bring to this, and also their desire to actually improve the system, that you create this notion that I can partner with you to make a change. And then the last would be that it's parents, educators, communities, invigorating more democratic and more accountable schools, that this democratic participation allows for people to support each other in bringing things about, challenging each other to do better, but also gets more people involved with it. It really makes public schools public. How do we engage in that process? Now, very often when you hear demand, people say, well, demand is, protesters are just out there saying, we want this and we want that. And so I want to give a very specific definition of what I mean by demand. It isn't just saying, I want this. It starts with, and it goes back to this level of knowledge, understanding, study, where the demand starts with a sense of, I have a sense of what's going on here, not being what should be going on here. And I want to be able to give an analysis of what that is. The second part is a set of values and expectations that, and I think it's an important word to use, that challenges schools to do more for students in partnership. The word challenge is very important. Even though it may be pushing people and saying you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing, it isn't a challenge based on blaming you for doing wrong. It's a challenge that's based on saying you can do better. And I think that's a very fundamental difference. And then third is in the demand, it's a bold, simple, and strategically compelling solution that mapped out will say, if we do these things, we can expect greater outcomes. And so that part of what gets built in this isn't just, we want you to do better. And the example I give is parents coming in and saying, you're not doing well in the school, we just want you to do better. Versus parents coming in and saying, we worked with researchers and a set of teachers, and we identified that there's a problem with our reading score at the second grade. We went out and looked at schools and practices that were effective in actually addressing this issue, and we believe you can actually implement some of these practices in your place. And so that it's the demand is not just to do better, but we're actually giving you information and are committing ourselves to helping that solution come apart. That's the support part. Strategically compelling, and this is a good quote from a group we work with in Providence. And when a person can see a direct connection between their investment, retention, and resources to the challenges and solutions identified. We very often ask parents and communities, I know this is true as a parent, I get paid to go to meetings, but if I didn't get paid to go to a lot of those meetings, I would not go. We often create meetings that aren't compelling to people, and they're not strategically compelling. People don't feel like going to that meeting or being involved in action actually is going to produce an outcome. So the strategically compelling part of the demand is it compels people to say, that is a solution that makes sense to me. It seems like it's doable. And you've also given me the strategy to be able to bring it about, that I'm going to invest my time and energy in wanting that to happen. Or if you are a policymaker, that it's strategically compelling, where you say, that's an idea that's really makes sense. It's connected to work that we're doing. And it's such that I would actually invest my time and energy in my capacity as a decision maker to support you in making that happen. So that's the strategically compelling conversation. These are some of the 5 change theories of elements. And I am going to go into a detailed example of this in practice, and so just bear with me on that. So the 5 areas are sort of context for genuine community and family partnerships, the potential of community organization, which I think is critical, the role of the staff in those organizations in supporting capacity building, the coming together of groups, the recognition that schools are in systems, and so we can't have expect individual organizations by themselves to be able to impact the system. So how do you create a system, a network of organizations within a community that are able to provide support and power to the process? And the role of research, institutions, strategic support groups, and helping inform and provide a context for people to be able to have their practice and their actions informed by research and support that not only they're given, but that they create and own. We'll go through this very quickly. I have some of these webinars, since there's not people that you see, you feel like you're talking a lot, and I guess you are, because it's 2 hours and you're supposed to fill it up. But I want to get to your engagement, because there's really great questions that you have. We start with some of the research that really, in a nutshell, again, I'm not going to read through this. We often start with this idea that the kind of engagement that we have between families, parents, communities, and educators is a problem. You know, how do we get more people involved? People aren't involved. People don't care. Teachers don't care about the kids. Kids don't care about the teachers. That becomes sort of the narrative that we have. And very often that's built into the structure that we have. There's often very little time for educators to do this kind of work. It's not necessarily what's built into their development in schools of teacher education. And very often there's also a power dynamic. The teachers very often see, if I bring parents into this process and have them involved, I'm losing power in that process. And so how do we figure out ways of shifting that? It becomes a critical part of how we think about in creating a better context for family engagement. The other part is that we often say parents don't care about these things and don't talk about these things, but very often people are talking about education. They want better things for their kids. They just may not be talking to schools about it. And so the Harvard group did this research on the private lives around engagement of parents, and what they found is people really seek these relationships to inform and help them make sense of the world. And if we make that schools, people are seeking information that helps them make sense about what goes on in schools. They're seeking opportunities to engage people around that. And so creating settings that allows that to happen is really important. And the other thing is that even though people may start and engage, I come to the school and I'm angry and I'm mad because there's a problem, that's not where people want to be. They ultimately want to be in a relationship that is positive. They might start there because that's what drew them there, but that's not where they stay. And if we recognize that and get through the anger and sometimes the frustration, then we often get to a place where we can actually create collaboration and engagement. And the example that we'll get later gives you a prime example of that. The power of communities. We really believe that community organizations that are in communities are an essential component to the kind of change that needs to happen in school systems in order to address the achievement gap. Here in New York City, we were saying that there are organizations that were already committed to improving their neighborhoods, either through housing development, economic development, job empowerment. So they were already looking at ways that they could change the kinds of services and resources that are in that community. We said, let's link with you to be able to add schools to part of that process and to be able to use your capacity and experience, and very often your relationships and your respect to be able to push an agenda along that maybe individual parents by themselves could not do. And we saw a growing number of groups that do that, and you'll see some examples in the resources about it. I'm actually going to switch to, I'll stay here. I want to say a couple things about the organizations. We looked at certain kinds of organizations in doing this, because there's a lot of organizations in communities. But we looked for those organizations that felt they had a responsibility and accountability to a particular constituency. Like they felt like we're part of this neighborhood. They had relationships. We often talk about it as organizations that had the 3 R's. Roots in a community, so that they've been there for a while and people knew them and understood them and respected them, which could be the 4th R. They had relationships, that people knew them, they were engaged with parents and communities in a way that you could use those relationships to share and inform information and provide information. And they had resources, because this work requires consistency, so they had staff and resources to be able to devote to this kind of work. And we look for those that were prepared to be able to do that. And I think the 4th bullet is really important here. We were looking for groups that were prepared to not only have these relationships, to utilize these relationships, but to actually create a democratic decision-making process that would actually allow for those parents and communities to decide and participate in developing the agenda for the kinds of things that they wanted to do. And that's a really important distinction, that they were able to have some sense of agency of what they were going to be able to do. We also look for organizations that had staff that also had those relationships, and the staff really focused in, and we pushed for sort of a community organizing model, which we don't have to go into detail, but the essential element here is that you created a context where you have staff that were prepared to support parents and community residents, not only to participate, but to assume leadership roles. And so if you came to a meeting, the next time you might participate in developing the agenda of the meeting. If you develop the agenda of the meeting, the next time you would help facilitate the meeting, maybe co-facilitate, so that each level, you're not just participating, but you're building skills and capacity that allow for you to be able to feel like you have something more to offer to the process, but it was really based on your capacity that you brought to make by joining. We talked a lot about once you have these organizations, that the challenge would often be that the organization may want to deal with something that has to deal with a particular school and they have a relationship, but what if they wanted to deal with something at a district or city level? Very often they didn't have the individual power to be able to do it. So we looked to figure out ways of developing coalitions of groups that could work together and build structures that would allow for them to come up with a shared agenda and be able to invest resources, staff to be able to do that. I felt in the work that I've done that one of the things that we often look at, and it's been one of the challenges that has come up in a lot of the questions. Part of the problem that we have with our schools is over the last, I would say definitely the last 10 years, but beyond that, there's been this massive disinvestment in schools. We've lost money, we've been closing schools, and I know that the educators and all of us, but I know the educators are feeling the impact of those reduction in resources. I would say there's been an equally damaging disinvestment in communities. And so organizations that had provided supports are dying because they don't have the resources to be able to provide the support. And we believe there needs to be an investment on both sides so that they can come together to be able to do this. And so we believe that this community infrastructure is something that needs to be built and supported because it's an essential component to being able to have a community system that works with the school system to be able to create the kind of change that we want. And then the last role here, I'm trying to look at mine to make sure that I'm getting close to the question, is the role of research and strategic support for family. And I saw we had a number of research folks who were involved on the webinar, and I think that's great. You know, one of the things we often talk about is that people may, people, when they do housing organizing, they're saying, I live in this house, and here's the things that we want to change, and I live in it, and I work with people to be able to give me a better understanding, but I live in the house. Or if I live in a community that I'm trying to change, I live in that community. But they don't live in the schools. And so in order for people to really be engaged in an informed way in education, they need access to data, they need access to information, they need access to best practices so that their participation is informed in the same way that very often the people that they're sitting with, educators and others, are informed. And so we believe there's a critical role for research organizations to not only do research, but to build relationships with organizations, with communities, with parents that allow for them to be participants in the research process. That's why, again, I spoke before about participatory action research, the ways that having parents actually involved in identifying the questions and doing the research, helping to do the research, helping to do the analysis, helping to decide on the findings. And what you have there is something that's very powerful because it takes the capacity of the researcher and the strategies of the researcher, but it links it with the capacity of community in a very important way. And I'll give one very quick example of how that worked. We were working with the group New Settlement Apartments, which was one of the core groups in CC9 that we'll talk about later. They had an after-school program. And what they discovered in their after-school program is the kids didn't seem to be reading very, very well. And so they asked us to come in and this is the time we were with NYU, with the Institute for Education and Social Policy. They asked us to come in and show them the data from the annual school report. In New York City, there's a report with data, test data, demographic data about the schools, the community, the students, the teachers that's produced every year on each school. And they asked us to come give the demographic data for PS64 in the South Bronx. And what they found is only 13% of the kids were reading at grade level. Now, first of all, they didn't know that because they never had access to that data before. So it's shocking for a lot of people because they never heard, they didn't know. And then they said, well, more people have to hear about this. We got to figure out how to get this information out. We shouldn't be the only ones to know this. And so naturally in your researcher hat, you say, well, why don't we just do a pie graph, big pie and then sliver that's 13. And like, nah, that's not going to work. And they said, well, we're going to have a bar graph, big tall bar. And so, no, that's not going to work. And it took a conversation about the data and what we were trying to convey and their capacity to know and understand their community to come up with a flyer. And the flyer had 100 kids on it. Each had a placard. 13 had a placard that said, I can read. 87 had a placard that said, I can't read. And then the caption underneath is, which one's your child? If you want to know, come to this meeting. Now, that's something we may have figured out, but chances are we wouldn't. But it required a setting, and it required a relationship that said, here's the capacity for us to share the data so that you know and understand it. But we needed, as researchers, the capacity and understanding of that community on how that data could be actually communicated that we could not have gotten without having that relationship. So that relationship becomes a very key and critical one. And here's just some examples in addition to the Annenberg Institute, a couple of other organizations that really do this work around collaboration. So I'm sure that you may have some examples of local and other groups that do it as well. And I'm going to end it there before going into the example that applies some of these in the CC9 example.
Thank you, Richard. I want to call our attention to the parking lot for just a moment because there's lots of great conversation I want you to glance at, but there's two questions that recently were posted for you. Sharon is asking, when you were talking about that prior example, she was wondering if there's new specialized staff hired to perform this function or are teachers adding this work, particularly around the staffing. I think she's interested. Right. So when you said teachers doing this work? Was that a part of the question? Yeah, that was the question she asked. Are teachers adding this work? Actually, and that's a good question if I wasn't clear on that. This is not work, the work that I was describing was actually work done by the organizations in collaboration with the teachers. And you'll see a little bit more in the example. And so the kind of staffing we're talking about coming in would actually be staff that was hired by and working with the community organization. Although many of the examples that we have, and I'll share the full film with you, but CC9 talks about it, a lot of our collaborations ended up including collaborations with both individual teachers or teachers at a school or also the union as a structure of teachers. And so that staff person then became the person who was the liaison with their counterpart within the teachers to be able to sort of figure out ways of building that kind of collaboration. But yes, and it does require a specialized capacity. We look for staff that often had some experience, even though they may not have been doing the work then and there around organizing, because it's clearly not service providing. Although we want to provide services and help people, it was really about building capacity of parents. And we wanted staff that really had the ability to be able to do that. Was there another question? There is another question. I'm not sure if you want to dive into this one, but Suzette is asking, what are your thoughts on the politics and the role of district leadership and school boards in being the gatekeepers of maintaining the status quo and blocking progress and changing the gap?
I would say that some questions are actually statements in the form of questions. I would agree. I think there's been a big challenge, and I think it's come from a lot of our communities. It's happened here in New York. We used to have 32 school districts, and each school district had its own board that was elected. And while there are problems, there's always problems and issues and challenges around those things. It was one where it was a democratic process where people felt like there was a place and space for them to be able to be engaged. And we've seen the movement towards the more appointed. We have a mayoral control system here in New York City. While it may create, and I think that's been the folks who are supportive of it touted that it eliminates some of the issues around dysfunction and problems around capacity and streamlines things. It also completely, in many cases, eliminates any kind of public participation in the process or even challenging participation in the process. And so we really feel like a lot of places are really trying to shift back to and trying to figure out a model that allows for there to be the more public involvement in that process. And even if there are school boards that are engaged in this work, that they have to be responsive or feel some accountability for the public. And accountability has to feel as though, the public has to feel as though they are able to impact the accountability of those groups. And if they're appointed by somebody else, very often that's a challenge. I'll give you one really quick example. Here in New York City, many years ago under Mayor Bloomberg, he was trying to push a new policy that would stop promotion. It was a social promotion policy, and he wanted to have promotion tied to I believe it was the third grade test reading scores. I can't remember if it's third or fourth grade. And at that time, we had gone to a mayoral control, and there was his appointments, so the people that he had appointed to the citywide board, he did a tally and realized they were going to vote against it. The vote was happening, I believe, on Monday night. And so Monday afternoon, he essentially removed all those folks and appointed some new folks who want to be in support of him. And so there's a part of this where, yes, maybe it does keep, it does create a system where good policy can get through that might have gotten eaten up by some of the other structures, but it does also create the lack of participation in the process, and we have to figure out a way of actually bringing more public into the education system.
Very good. Well, let's turn our attention to the question on the screen, following up from this last segment where you described some good examples of the work that the Annenberg Institute is doing. Let's hear from our audience about the examples they might have of schools or districts that have used the help of outside partnerships. And then the second part of the question, have those partnerships been successful in addressing the achievement gap? So we'll put up another poll box, have you post some of your thoughts there. Lots of great sharing over there in the parking lot and seeing folks who are doing great things, and others who are getting wonderful ideas from that. There was an interesting question we had that came in before today's event, Richard, and I'm thinking maybe now it might be a great time to just briefly address it. Someone asked, does closing the achievement gap work differently in higher performing schools? So we're talking a lot about the schools or the groups that have low performance, but is there a way to close the achievement gap when, for all intents and purposes, the school is doing pretty well?
Right. And I think it's right. And I think again, not being achievement gap being a very broad statement. Sometimes it talks about the gap being between those low-performing schools and those high-performing schools. But sometimes there are those gaps that exist within schools themselves. And I think one of the strategies that came from NEA that was talking about having to look at our ability grouping structure and who has access to particular classes. Sometimes we can build in some of those gaps in the way we have it structured. One of them is, there's been a big push is access to AP courses. The College Board has said one of the strongest indicators of college success is not whether you pass the AP exam, but just taking the AP course, access to that rigorous kind of instruction. And so people have been looking for ways of how do we look at ways we might be actually building in some of these achievement gaps in the ways that we've structured the system. So I know in a lot of high-performing schools, you might see some internal segregation along the lines of AP honors classes tend to be populated by one group, where the others are populated in the more general education. So a lot of places have been looking at the ability grouping, tracking, and even building opportunities for kids to be able to be in more mixed group settings.
Yeah, and I think that was an example some folks gave in one of the prior questions, with a few examples related to tracking, so that makes sense. All right, so looking here, let's see what kind of outside partnerships folks have been engaged in.
So I'm saying about, it's interesting, this we talked a little bit about, I was looking at this as actually in the parking lot, but it's connected, this notion of looking at all work being done through an equity lens, which is, I think, is a very interesting. We talk about the achievement gap, but I think it's not, and I think this question talks about our response needs to be done with some sense of what are we doing that is actually looking at addressing issues of not just inequity, but our vision of what we think equity is. And so how do we begin to create systems and strategies that are based on equity?
So it looks like some of the examples here to the question relate to specific populations of need in various communities. It's interesting, Betty talks about a program that serves migrant farm workers and their children. That's a unique population.
Mm-hmm.
We've talked, I see an example of university partnerships, and that's something that comes up in almost all of our webinars, and how do we use our universities to support K-12 and vice versa, and make sure there's collaboration there, and this is a good place for that.
Just by way of naming a challenge on our side, I've worked at NYU and also at Brown. There's often a challenge on the side of those of us who work in the university settings to get those institutions to see this as what should be a part of their practice. There's sometimes it could be an orthodoxy, a sense of well, if you're a university, you do research that is done in this way. And the idea of building new knowledge and collaboration for these kinds of partnerships very often is, we sometimes swim upstream to be able to do that. And but I think it's critically important. I think it should be a part of a university's mandate to actually provide that kind of support to the schools around it. One of the things you'll find is very often some of the most dysfunctional and difficult relationships are between universities and the community surrounding them. And we think this is a way for a university to actually invest in and take resources that have and invest in the communities that they should be a part of.
There's a few other nice examples there. The work in Houston ISD, which I know Jeffrey was sharing some more details of that in the parking lot. So that sounds like really good work happening there.
I saw the Portland, Oregon in the parking lot.
Yes, some really great things happening in some of our districts around the country, and I'm really pleased to see people sharing their experiences. I know it's good for everyone to see those successes.
Right.
Well, in the spirit of time, we're going to move this poll off, and I'm going to let you continue on into the next section where you talk a little bit more about a case study for us.
Okay, very good. Thanks. And so I want to talk a little bit about case study, and there should be, you'll see a section in the web link, about a 10, I think maybe a 12-minute video that gives you a description of what I'm about to talk to you about, the CC9. We have a film called Parent Power. It's a full 30 minutes, and if people are interested in it, I'll share the link to it, the full film to the folks here. But this is a segment that describes the CC9 strategy, and so I'm going to just do a very quick overview of it and pull out some of the examples of some of the things that we're just talking about in theory and showing them in practice. And so this case study is going to look at where we went with our work, and I'll just give a little bit of context, and we'll talk a little bit about it later. Is that our work in New York City, and we started doing some of the work nationally. What we found is that there were a number of organizations that took on this strategy of taking on education as a part of their work. They built trust relationships with a set of parents. They developed parent action groups, different parent advocacy groups that would identify a particular issue that they wanted to work on, do some research, develop a set of demands as we defined it before, and push forward to move things that they felt the research and their relationships with educators would actually help to improve the quality of education in their schools. And we saw a growth of organizations from a few dozen to, we haven't done a study recently, but there are at least, I think, 800 or 900 groups that are doing this kind of work for education organizing across the country at a local, state, and national level. And a lot of them had built and made real changes. Here in New York City, there's a development of a school leadership teams that were created and had parents as a part of it throughout the New York City school system. There was a big push for nonprofit development of facilities. There were a lot of facilities that people wanted to create in New York City to deal with the facility problem that would not only be useful for expanding school capacity, but also could be used by communities for different kinds of activities. So there were a lot of initiatives that were happening that there were these successes, but there were also challenges to it, and we'll talk a little bit about it. And we're going to talk about it in the context of the South Bronx, and this is just some quick demographic information about the South Bronx that sort of talks to you about the population that it serves, gives you sort of the ethnic breakdown of Black and Latino, and also some of the poverty level that existed in the South Bronx that was higher than both the other parts of New York City and also New York State averages. But the South Bronx also had a number of organizations that were invested in improving the quality of life and services in the community. New Settlement Apartments, and you'll see it in the film, was a group that invested in building 1,000 units of low and moderate income housing, developed after school and social programs for kids, adult education programs, and actually was running the after school program in PS 64. And so they had built this structure that says we can invest in building greater capacity and greater services in our community. And they were the first to actually take on this effort of wanting to do education organizing, worked and did an organizing campaign in PS 64 that's a part of the film in the early part of it. But then they began to identify a challenge that had happened. And I'm actually going to go to the next panel that talks a little bit about it. What we found is that very often when a group would do this work, they would come to the school and say, you know, we see a problem, we'd really like to help you. And very often, going back to what we described, sometimes the initial responses by schools was one of a feeling as though the parents were coming onto their turf. There would be a bit of a pushback. And very often what that created was an adversarial dynamic between the groups. So even though groups very often won their eventual campaign, they ended up being in an adversarial relationship with the educators in the system. They had to push them to be able to do it. And so there was a desire to change that, because they felt you can't do anything in schools if you have a adversarial relationship with educators. So we've got to figure out some way of doing that. But we want to do so in a way that doesn't give up our power. We don't want to just to roll over. We've got to figure out some way that allows for us to be able to speak powerfully about what we want, but do so in a way that is seen as an invite for collaboration as opposed for confrontation. The other reason that they wanted to make that change is that very often they found that even though they were able to get successful campaigns, they were never able to get campaigns that dealt with issues of teaching and learning. In large part because in order for you to do that, you had to have the participation of the educators themselves in wanting to open that process up to analysis and support. And so there was an effort to change the model that allowed for the organizing to really still talk about the traditional building of power and demand within the organizing effort, but also to do so in a way that actually forged a relationship, an open relationship with educators. And the way that we did that was to reach out to the teachers union. Now, if any of you have actually seen Eyes on the Prize 2, you'll see there's a story about Brownfield Ocean Hill, which was a segment on a community-controlled school that was largely Black and Latino, and there was a pushback on the teachers union at the time, Al Shanker, and it was a really very toxic point in the history between teachers and communities in New York City, and there's still remnants of that today. The relationship between the union and communities of color was one wrought with difficulty, and so the idea of building a collaboration with that union was a really difficult one. But people felt that it was important to be able to get to educators, and since this was a structure that had educators that could support it, we needed to get that. And we were able to find leadership within the union that was also committed to that kind of thing. And so the idea of CC9 was to say, how do we begin to develop a set of strategies that allow for us to engage with educators around a core set of instructional needs? And it also recognized the thing that we talked about before, that NSA said, we're finding PS64 while we're trying to make changes here. A lot of the challenges have to do with District 9, which PS64 is a part of. And we can't do that by ourselves, so they reached out to these other organizations, Citizen Advice Bureau, and Clergy Coalition, and others to be able to participate in this coalition along with the union to be able to form this new kind of collaboration that hopefully would pull the power of those groups and identify some core things that they could work on together. And what the group identified, and I'll talk a little bit about this slide a little later, but let me just say something that was really important about the development. There were three things that were really, really key. One was we needed to get, and I think you may have heard me talk about before, this idea where very often the first reaction when you bring parents and teachers together, not always, but very often is a period where people will respond to that person based on the experience of the last person. And so if you had a bad experience with a teacher, and very often people in these communities they would respond to the next educator that they saw based on that experience. And the same would be for teachers. And so there was a period of time in building this collaboration that was just bringing people in the room and letting them actually, they had to yell at each other for a little while, but keeping them in the room to get past that point, to the point where if you stay in the room long enough, you're able to get past all that and get to fix the real issues. And so we were able to do that in 6 months of one-on-one conversations and meetings with folks where we finally got to an issue where parents said, we're realizing when we look at the data, and again, this is a role of the data, that we see this stream of teacher mobility. We have teachers that come in, they spend a few years here and they leave, and it's been happening for years. And we realize we cannot do anything about improving the quality of practice in this district until we stop that flow. And once we got past the you don't care about the kids here, that's why you leave, and all this different, we got to really what was the core issue. And teachers began to open up and say, The reason that we leave here is that nobody's investing in making us better teachers. I hate coming to school every day and feeling like a failure. So why would I want to come back to school that's not investing in making me a better teacher? I want to go someplace where I feel good about what I do. I came here because I was committed to education and committed to it, but I can't do it alone, and I can't do it without somebody investing in helping me do that. And the parents heard that. And so what they did, and going back to our strategy of shared practice, they began to develop a different set of rituals together. So it goes beyond this notion of parent-teacher conference. And I want to really sort of get on that. You know, we often try to say there should be a relationship with a parent and a teacher, but we set up structures that, you know, they meet twice a year for an hour or for a half hour. And they're supposed to build a relationship based on that. And we think you need to create different sets of rituals and opportunities, some within schools, some within communities. So very often these meetings took place in communities with educators that allow for them to engage in different ways, talk in different ways, actually work together on solving a particular problem to create different kinds of, a different sense of what their collaboration could look like. And so the teachers and the parents began to study different places, to look at something. They ended up looking at the Master Teacher Program in Rochester. And through the research, through the dialogue, they developed something called the Lead Teacher Program. I'll come back to this one. I'm going to get to the Lead Teacher. The Lead Teacher Program. And the Lead Teacher Program was a concept that was based on having a teacher come into one of the schools that wasn't performing well. And that teacher would spend 50% of their time in the classroom and 50% of their time providing instruction, particularly to newer teachers. And that was a pilot, that was an idea that the community, the union, and actually the district, which was shifting, was saying, we're really in support of this. But we don't have the money for it. So the organizing, that demand capacity, parents said, well, we're going to get petitions, we're going to start pushing, we're going to push the mayor and the school district to invest money in this. You guys may not be able to do that as a union or as a district, but that's where we can bring our power to demand to actually bring this about. And they were able to get I think it was $1.6 million devoted to piloting this project in 10 schools, elementary schools in the South Bronx. It's important to really recognize that shared capacity. There were often assets that each could bring to the process that helped shape the relationship in a new way. The parents really loved the idea, and it was one of the first challenges in building a relationship. Parents said, we want to be able to come to the classrooms just to see what's going on in the class. And there was teachers said, well, you just can't all come in mass in our classrooms. So there was this negotiation that took place to help them figure out how to have parents come in ways that weren't disruptive to the class, but that was instrumental in parents actually seeing what teachers do and understanding it. So their image of teaching wasn't based on what they heard from somebody else or from their past experience. It was from a real-life experience. Conversely, teachers were in communities and in these settings where they heard parents talking passionately, effectively, and in an informed way because of the research about what they wanted for education. So it shifted their notion of what teachers, what parents and communities could do. And so it created this opportunity to develop this new model. The other thing is, very often you'll see in dynamics where teachers say, I want more money, that the public and parents will just say, well, that's just you guys wanting more money. The difference here was these positions actually had I believe it was either a $10,000 or $15,000 bump for these teachers for this new practice. And parents didn't have a problem with it because they knew the new money wasn't just about paying somebody, and I don't know what it is. It's disconnected from any sense of what it's going to get me. They knew that new money was going to go to something that they had worked on, that they had established, and they knew that it was going to actually, or they believed that it was strategically compelling, that was going to be able to produce an outcome. And so they were able to organize this effort. They piloted it in 10 schools, and what they saw was a dramatic reduction in teacher mobility and a dramatic increase in test scores and student performance. And what they found is there was an independent study done by that was AED who did the study that showed that clearly the program of having the teachers involved, it was important, but the community component was quite critical. What they found is the parents were involved in actually developing the interview questions, and were involved in the interviews of the teachers, so the teachers could see that there was investment on the part of parents in this process. It was one of the, I think, the first time that the union actually invited the parents and communities into the negotiation with the district for this program. So it created a new set of dynamics and relationship between educators and organizations that represent educators, and communities and parents and organizations that represented them, to be able to build capacity to actually produce a program that had a direct impact on student learning. I want to go back to quickly this notion of concept of accountable collaboration. And it's very quickly, it's a notion that this isn't just parents, communities demanding more of teachers without saying we also have some accountability in this process. And conversely, it isn't them saying there is no accountability, even of the people that are participating in partnership with us. It's a sense that there's a process that each of the folks who are in this collaboration have a clearer sense of the roles, expectations, and capacities, I would say, of each of the partners. So there was a greater sense of, I want to be in collaboration because there's some power and capacity that these parents and communities bring to me as an educator. And conversely, that allow for us to be able to say, we're going to hold each other mutually accountable to be able to do the things that we know we're able to do. And we're going to be able to have that accountability because I have a sense of what you can bring to the process, and conversely, you have a sense of it. And it's through that collaboration that you build the power that allows for you to be able to push systems that you couldn't do individually. Here's just a quick timeline to give you, I don't need to go over it, but it gives you sort of a sense of the amount of time that it took to be able to develop. So I don't want to give you the sense that this happened all in a year. It took a lot of time and energy to be able to invest in this. And to probably a question earlier, one of the challenges, and you'll see it in the film, when the program went citywide, they got rid of the community program, community part of it. In part because, and I think this has been one of the challenges for us, and it goes back to the investment in community capacity, the kind of organizational capacity that existed in that community in the South Bronx didn't necessarily exist in other places. And so we really do believe that there needs to be a strong investment on building that capacity so that when programs like this come in place, there is an equally strong and viable community infrastructure that allows for them to participate in it. Just a couple of very quick examples of other collaborations. There's been a big push for community schools here in New York City. It's been sort of the next stage of our work. It's a direct connection to what you saw in some of the Comer model and the other things were in the research, where there's the talk about how do you create structures that allow for schools to be able to engage with a range of issues. The community schools has really been using the idea and concept of schools as a hub for a range of supports that could be provided for schools, and that there's collaboration between the organizations that provide those supports in the schools in delivering them. And here are some key elements, and again, this is from the Alliance to Reclaim Our Schools, which is actually a national effort of not only the NEA, AST, 1199, and a number of other organizations across the country, sort of a definition of what they see as critical elements of community schools. And the idea is not just community schools are about wraparound services, but it's around how also to engage those communities in ways that help support a curriculum that's engaging, culturally relevant, and challenging. How does it support teaching so that these relationships not are just about being there, but like the CC9 effort, are there ways to actually invest in and push for investment in teaching, or move away from testing, a shift around the restorative practices. That's been part of that's the involvement of youth organizations, saying that that's a critical part. You see the social emotional support developments that needs to be a key part of it, and to really look at the notion of parent and community involvement as transformational. The idea that it isn't just at the periphery, but it's really connected to issues of teaching and learning, and how do we bring it in. A couple of very quick examples. I saw in one of the questions we got earlier about home visits. We think that is one of the key examples of a strategy that really is focused on building relationships between parents and communities. It's a program that actually started very similarly to the CC9, a conversation between an organizing group in Sacramento and the union about how to build relationships and trust. and has developed to be statewide and international. And it's really about, the home visits aren't about coming in and talking about what's going on with the students. They're really a step that brings the teacher into the home of the parent, and they don't even bring anything to write anything down so that people are sensing that you're writing about it. It's really just about how do you create a trust partnership with families and get to know the family and have them get to know you. And it's a program that has actually had tremendous results and tremendous impact, not only in involvement of parents, but positive outcomes and student achievement. The academic parent-teacher teams is an attempt to really say, how do we take this notion of engagement with parents that we often limit to parent-teacher conferences, and how do we expand that to be much more comprehensive and focused on academics, and so that it expands between the 1 or 2 meetings that are half an hour to larger 75-minute classroom meetings that really have the parent and teacher delving into data, looking at home activities, not only talks about what's going on, but strategies that are connected. They're deeper and more frequent engagements between parents. There's also opportunities for parents to be involved in individual meetings with the parents and teachers, and there's also, in many of them, opportunities for trainings and workshops for parents to develop their capacity as part of it. And as you see, the results have been quite good. So that's, and I was trying to go put my New York speed on the talking to be able to get through it quickly, but I hope I didn't talk too fast.
You did okay. I think what we'll do in the interest of time is just skip over this question. I'll just leave it here for a moment, though, so that folks can reflect on it. I think we've shared a lot of these examples throughout today's discussion, and in the parking lot I see lots of sharing. So we just wanted folks to reflect and think about the relationships that you've seen between parents, communities, and educators, and those that have been particularly useful in contributing to the improvement of student outcomes. So I know y'all have examples. If you feel inclined, you can post something in the parking lot, but I do want us to move forward. So Richard, you can take us through the action steps pretty quickly here, and then we'll open up one more last poll so we can have folks tell us what their action steps are.
Absolutely. So the action steps, and I think part of this is really, I'm not going to go into deep because we talked about it before. Clearly we want to, much of our effort is really about how to drive opportunities for there to be more investment in teacher education programs, both pre and during professional development opportunities, and look for ways for those things to actually embed parents, communities, and young people as part of the process. There's one really interesting strategy that was used in New Orleans. This is pre-Katrina, where the professional development actually created a relationship with one of the youth organizing groups, and they used to bring students in to actually try different things in education with the kids, and so they would actually do a class or something with the kids, and then they would get feedback from the kids about what they thought. I thought it was a really interesting way to use students as a part of the professional development and seeing that and having some expertise, and so how do we begin to do that? And the idea that data-driven is really a key part of what we think, both with the parents and communities and with educators. The access to data and opportunities to develop their own data is quite critical. Suggestions for community, very quickly, we talked about creating opportunities for new kinds of relationships that build new kinds of rituals and developments. Identifying organizations that have this capacity to be able to build this. And one of the things we often tell schools is sometimes you end up trying to invest a lot of energy in creating a relationship with a set of parents, when if you just created a relationship with an organization that already has those relationships with parents, you'd be able to get to more people, and you'd also have an infrastructure in that organization to support you in getting information to people. So how do you utilize those organizations in an important way? You're building relationships, not transactions. So the idea is, how do you begin to see people in a way that isn't just a couple of meetings, but is a long-term relationship where you get an opportunity to know each other and engage each other. The Asians should be active relationships, not just coming to meetings, but actually doing things and engaging in questions. And then seeking collaborations, again, with folks who can help support that work. This is this emphasis of it. talking a little bit about what the gap is, addressing the needs. And on the last point, I really do feel like my mother was a teacher, and she often told me, she said, the hardest job I had as a teacher other than being a parent. And I think that we strongly believe that when we've seen settings that have created the possibility for parents and educators and families and communities to pool their power, that they have a different kind of dialogue about the work, that it isn't wrought with this notion of, even the charter conversation has been a really interesting one, where if you have it at the community level, it's less ideal, there's less ideology involved with it, there's less politics. It's really about what is going to work, and dealing with the reality of those things, and dealing with the issues of race and racial realities. And so the involvement of, I think, parents and teachers and communities, particularly at the local level in these dialogues, is critical to actually having them be about producing changes in the achievement gap and not just political conversations about it.
Well done. Well, that was a really jam-packed 2 hours with a lot of really great information, flowing on all sides. And in the spirit of the webinar series and the way we would like folks to take this information and go out into your respective workplaces and communities where you work, to take back what you've learned. So we're going to pose 2 additional questions here to close out today's session. We'd like to know what were your key takeaways from today's discussion, and then also what action steps do you plan to take. So we'll get those up, give you a few minutes to get some responses there.
Can I just say?
Yes, go ahead.
I was just going to say very quickly, I want to thank you guys, the folks who helped to set this up. You guys have really been tremendous, and I want to thank you for that. And even though I'm used to doing presentations in front of people, and so that it's opportunity to see more, but I've just really been struck by the thoughtful questions and comments from people. And I'm sorry that I wasn't able to answer all of them, but I wanted to acknowledge that, like I said, I'm not an expert on this. I just have done this for 30 years, but there's a lot of expertise and capacity in the folks that are here, and I want to acknowledge that. And thank you for sharing that information with us.
Yes, very much. That is the essence of this webinar series, and I think it's appropriate. This being the last of the series, this is year 4. We've done 32 of these webinars. It's hard to believe. I've facilitated every single one, and I hope there's folks in the audience who have attended for a good number of those. But we've seen the success of the series has been in the engagement of our communities, of our attendees, people from all over the country coming to us and telling us what their experience is. And I think that has made such a richer experience for everyone. Our presenters always walk away and have that same comment, that it was so engaging and so enlightening to hear from those who are out in the field doing this work. And, you know, we encourage everyone to keep up the great work. And when you need assistance, the REL has a lot of resources. If you haven't attended our prior webinars, they're all archived. You can go to the REL Mid-Atlantic site and download those. If you do have questions that you didn't feel got answered today, I'm going to put up a slide in just a minute that has Richard's email information. You can certainly reach out to him with specific questions about today's topic. If you have general questions about the webinar series or something I can answer, my information will be there, as well as a general REL Mid-Atlantic email that you can reach out to. But let's turn our attention here and take a look at some takeaways and some action steps. I think you hit home the point, Richard, that the engagement of the community and parents is crucial. Looks like folks are going to take the material and share with their colleagues. We like it when you do that. And as I mentioned, all the materials will be archived. You should get an email in about 2 weeks, probably right after the holidays, letting you know that the archive is available, and you can certainly share that. We'd like you to do that.
Terrific. Yes, this is these great comments. Right.
Well, at this time, I'd like to give you a virtual round of applause, Richard, and have our audience do the same. You have made this presentation what it is today, and we really appreciate you sharing your experiences and the work that you've done. As I said, let me move on to the slide that has your email information so folks can grab that if they want to.
Please. And again, it may be either questions that I can answer or, I just represent a small portion of the capacity of Annenberg, so if there are others that I can either direct you to here or folks that I know to maybe get you a more detailed response, I'll do my best.
Very good. And we value your input as participants in today's webinar, so we hope you'll take a few minutes now to fill out our survey and give us your feedback on today's session and on the series as a whole. And we will hopefully see you in some other event of this type in the future. And as I said, keep up the great work in pursuing what's best for students all around the country. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.